Have you ever heard of the women who pushed the Mexican Revolution forward and helped in every way they possibly could? Okay, dumb question. Silly of me to think that women would actually get credit for anything, but I guess that's why we're here today. Maybe it's finally time we actually acknowledge these women and give them the recognition that they deserve.
And of course, these women were Las Soldaderas. They have inspired multiple modern feminist icons within media, and many people don't even know about it. This video is going to take a deep dive into Las Soldaderas, how they evolved into Las Adelitas, and how this sexualization has carried over into modern movements such as the Chicana movement, which took on the vision of a strong, beautiful soldier who didn't have to be one or the other. She could be both. Now, before we get into all that, I should probably tell you who Las Soldaderas were. These were any women who were participating in the Mexican Revolution from 1910 to 1920. They played a whole bunch of roles within the revolution, from being on the front lines to making home-cooked meals for soldiers on the road. They were really doing it all. These women came from many different backgrounds, such as peasant farmers, urban workers, and indigenous communities, but they all had the common cause of wanting to fight for the revolution. Another thing they all had in common was that men didn't want them there. It was a pretty big thing for a woman to be in the military, let alone being above other men, and they did not like that. It hurt their masculinity, it made them insecure, because how dare a woman be better than a man ever? Now, don't get me wrong, Las Soldaderas really had no issues with this, because if they were going to accept them as women, they were going to dress like men, and that's exactly what they did. The largest reason I found about why they chose to dress like men actually started because women who wanted to participate in the revolution could not progress ranks in the military, so they would be the lowest rank they could possibly be. Even if they were better than every single man in their squadron, they would still be the lowest rank. It really didn't matter, just because they were women. And the second reason that they chose to dress like men was actually because there wasn't many of them per troop. You weren't really staying in one place during the revolution, you were traveling, you were doing different things, and there wouldn't be a whole bunch of women with them. So usually it was one woman in a group of men, and that meant sexual assault and abuse was very, very common. So these women just found it easier to dress like men because they could avoid the men, basically. So now that there's hopefully a better understanding of Las Soldaderas and who they were, we're going to be talking about Las Adelitas, which is basically the same thing as Las Soldaderas, except they were viewed through the male gaze instead of just being women existing in the world. And if you don't know what the male gaze is, I've pulled the definition right off of Google for you. The perspective of a notionally typical heterosexual man considered as embodied in the audience or intended audience for films and other visual media, characterized by a tendency to objectify or sexualize women. So now, instead of being seen as women soldiers who just simply wanted to participate in the revolution, they were seen as sexy objects who chased around sergeants because they were madly in love with them, and followed the war because they were beautiful but also brave. So I'm just going to play a small clip from a traditional Mexican folk song that was really popular during the revolution called Adelita. And then afterwards we'll talk about the lyrics and go through it a little bit more in depth.
En lo alto de la abrupta serranía, acampado se encontraba un regimiento y una joven que valiente lo seguía, locamente enamorada de un sargento. Popular entre la tropa era Adelita, la mujer que el sargento idolatraba, porque a más de ser valiente era bonita, y hasta el mismo coronel la respetaba.
So the main purpose of me playing this song in specific is because this was a campfire song that started to go around from troop to troop when they realized that women were participating in the revolution dressed as men. And it insinuates the idea that this woman only followed along because she was madly in love with the sergeant, and it was this crazy idea that even the colonel could respect her because, what? Respecting women? Oh my god? And I wanted to include this song because it was the start of a very slippery slope. This doesn't really seem so bad, but some of the more modern sexualizations you get of Las Soldaderas are pretty bad. A good example that you might not even know about is actually Princess Leia from Star Wars. So George Lucas took inspiration from the Las Soldaderas hair, which they would braid it and fold it into 2 buns on each side, and he said he wanted to have a character who was strong, independent, and could fight on her own, just like Las Soldaderas. And then he turned her into a slave. So I don't know what to say about that. So these women, who weren't even dressing like women, were being turned into this, and this, and this. It was not good, and it's a really great example of how no matter what women do, they will always be viewed sexually, especially when it's through the male gaze. Now, luckily enough, in modern day and age, women can sometimes stand up for themselves. So the movement that I want to focus on is the Chicano movement, or more specifically, the Chicana movement. 2 different words. So actually, at the time of this movement, which was about the 1960s, Chicano was a slur for Mexican people. Now, to summarize the movement very shortly, it was basically all about being proud of your heritage, being proud of who you were, and being proud of the fact that you weren't white, because you didn't have to be white to be proud of who you were. We're not going to be talking too much about the movement itself, but more a subunit of the movement, the Brown Berets, specifically the females. So during the Chicana movement, they actually started to use Las Adelitas as inspiration and an icon for their group. It's also important to mention that this is the Chicana movement, not the Chicano movement. So in a letter addressed to the Brown Berets national headquarters, the women of the Los Angeles chapter collectively resigned on February 25, 1970, citing a great exclusion on behalf of the male segment. They go on, "We have been treated as nothings and not as revolutionary sisters. We have found that the Brown Beret men have oppressed us more than the pig system. It was really, really hard to leave. It led to a lot of fights, but it also felt very freeing," says Gloria Arellanes, the first woman who resigned from the group. I also just wanted to touch on my own feelings on this a little bit because it's my project. I can do whatever I want. I can't, actually. Please give me a 100. Please give me a 100. Anyways, so I think it's important to mention that Las Soldaderas is history repeating itself with the Brown Berets. Both are groups of women who were pushed out by men just because they wanted to fight for the same cause, which I find ridiculous. If someone is standing in your doorstep saying, "I want to help you," why would you turn them away? I just find that super ridiculous. Moving on though, I think it's really inspiring how the Brown Berets took on Las Adelitas as a vision for their movement. Instead of being offended by this image, they said, "Yeah, guess what? I'm hot and I'm a soldier." And they also kind of snatched it away from the male gaze. It became more about, you can be a woman and you can be strong and you can do whatever you want. We're not here for the male gaze. We're here because we're women and we're powerful too.